With us today, joining us at the Pivotal Network. Tom's been a friend and supporter of the Pivotal Network since the very beginning. Tom Hatch is actually a member of our advisory board, and he was one of the early folks that we asked to join the advisory board. I've known about Tom and his work for a long time now, and really respected his insights into thinking about systems level challenges in K-12 education. But he does so by actually kind of getting down into the nitty gritty. And I think really powerfully for our group, as well as powerfully for kind of the scholarship of understanding K-12 education and how to have impact in it. He does so by looking at stories. So he's really a storyteller. And one of the reasons we invited him here is we're just hoping to give the pivotal educators, the high school teachers here with us in particular, a chance to kind of meet members of our advisory board and see what they're all about. So you folks last fall had a chance to talk to Brian Dewsbury and to David Deming, who are two other members of our advisory board. So kind of Tom's continuing in that tradition, but Tom's also here because he's on a book tour, and we're just like a stop on his book tour because this book just came out in the middle of the pandemic, The Education We Need for a Future We Can't Predict. And I don't know, Tom, if you chose that title before the pandemic hit, but I can't imagine a better title for what a book that's been published within the last year than thinking for this group in particular, but thinking about education that we all need, that our students need, and for a future that we can't predict. So, Tom, it is my absolute privilege to introduce you here. He hails to us from New York, Columbia Teachers College, where he's been for a number of years and does really powerful work, I think especially with school systems, public school systems in New Jersey. And so if I'm right, Tom, you're set to kind of take over the microphone now and start off the way we start almost everything here, which is telling us about a little bit of your background by focusing around a pivotal moment. Am I right on this count?
Yes, that sounds perfect. And just to make two quick connections, just in answer to the question about the book. So the title definitely came before the pandemic, and then to illustrate the vagaries of academics and academic publishing, they spent a year trying to convince me that that was not the right title. So fortunately, we stuck with it, and that was good. But the second piece is just one part of my autobiography that I wasn't going to mention, but I think is certainly relevant here, is that how I met Randy originally, and ultimately Heidi as well, was through the Carnegie Academy for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, which was situated out in California in the 1990s, where I was working. And what we were trying to do was create a network of teacher scholars, folks who were scholars of teaching, were expert teachers in higher ed and K-12 or K-12, writing about their work, reflecting on it, and learning from people like Randy and Heidi. But that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in this network. I think these kinds of networks, collaborations that bring people together off such a great cross-section of geographies and subjects are really powerful and critical in developing the education we need moving forward. For me, the development of those relationships is crucial to developing the social movements that we need for really changing education. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about and part of what the book is about. So let me just share my screen with a PowerPoint. I don't want to make it too formal. It does have pictures of my kids in it, which is the main reason for doing it. But I will invite you, please, to chime in on the chat. And if I don't pick it up on the chat, raise your hand, jump in, grab me, whatever. But I look forward to talking with you about this work and its implications for your own work in the Pivotal Network and for our work collectively moving forward. But as Heidi said, the name of the book is The Education We Need for a Future We Can't Predict. And in part, I think what we need moving forward is an education that responds to this question that I think we're often wrestling with when it comes to issues of educational reform. And Andy Hargreaves and Dennis Shirley put it well when they put this question forward, and they said, well, should schools be improving what they already do, or should they be embracing innovation, not merely making existing practice more effective, but transforming their practice and perhaps even the nature of their institutions altogether? And I wrote the book in a way to say that my answer to this question is yes. We have to do both. We can't break up into two camps, one who thinks, the system can be salvaged and we can make some improvements, and others who think it has to be radically transformed. The reality is that the problems are so significant and so deep that we have to work together and do both simultaneously. And that's what I talk about in the book, trying to talk about how we can make the schools we have right now more efficient, more effective, and more equitable. But at the same time, talking about what it takes to, move the chat there, what it takes to develop the common understanding, capacity, and collective responsibility that'll help to fuel those social movements that can really transform education into the future. In the book, I deal with both of those. Right now, in terms of the story I'm going to tell, I'm going to talk mostly about why I think it's so important to focus on social movements, but then I hope in the conversation we can talk more about some of those concrete things I think we can do together. But in terms of my own background, as a graduate student, I worked with Howard Gardner, who's a psychologist, who many of you may know was the developer of the theory of multiple intelligences, which essentially argues that we have a wide variety of abilities that go beyond logical, mathematic, and linguistic that are worth paying attention to both inside school and out. And it was a fascinating time to be working with Gardner because this theory really took off, and it gave us an opportunity to work with teachers, school leaders, educators all around the country and all around the world who wanted to create more personalized learning environments, more student-centered environments, environments that really embraced a much wider range of abilities, including and especially socio-emotional interpersonal abilities. And I wish I could say that all of that work was a smashing success. The reality is that in fact, it was really a crash course in the failures of US large-scale efforts to reform our schools. Yes, there were certainly some isolated successes, and I met a tremendous number of fabulous and wonderful people, many of whom are continuing to do this work. But over and over again, we just experienced the difficulties of taking even something that was successful in one instance and trying to spread it so that it could have a broader impact on the system as a whole. And so that is at least in part, why when Randy met me, I did not necessarily have the rosiest view when it came to the powers of education. But I did have an opportunity when after I got to Teachers College around 2003, I had a chance to go on sabbatical. And I was so depressed at that point that I thought, look, I just want to get out of the country and go to some places where there are higher performing education systems, higher performing schools, so I can learn from some stuff that's actually working. And so I set out to study what was happening in places like Singapore and Finland, which are well known for having high performing education systems, at least as far as it comes to tests like the international PISA tests and other things. We can talk about the problems with those tests later, but it was just one way to sort of find some places where maybe something better was going on. Through a variety of quirks, I actually ended up in Norway. And while from a US perspective, Norway and Finland are basically the same country, the reality is that Finland has a high performing education system and Norway performs about the same as the US on tests like PISA. So while a lot of people in the United States were saying, well, there's no possible way that we can do what Finland does because they're just a small homogenous social welfare state, I was suddenly in a position where I had to explain why a small homogenous social welfare state like Norway also couldn't do what Finland was doing, which was really a fascinating challenge. But that experience really turned out to be, as you would say in these terms, a pivotal moment. Although it was a pivotal year, I think you could say. I was there with my children at the time, who included Stella, who was actually going into kindergarten, Hannah, who was a 6th grader at the time, Clara, who was a 4th grader. And Hannah has now just graduated from college. Clara is a junior in college, and Stella is, along with all of you, suffering through high school during the pandemic as a junior. So some things have changed. But very quickly, as soon as we got to Norway, we began to learn some things about the Norwegian education system that were different than we expected. And one of those was that, in fact, after waiting for a number of years to get all of our children into school, Stella was just about to start full-day kindergarten, and Karen and I were just ready to crack a bottle of champagne and think about the time we would have to actually get to work, when we discovered that, in fact, Norway doesn't start formal school education until 1st grade. So much for that idea. So we were, again, trying to find childcare for Stella. But that was just one indication that actually formal education and formal schooling in Norway takes much less time than it does in the US. And in fact, we discovered that again, almost the first day when we dropped Hannah and Clara off at their primary school. And about 1:30, that was about 8:30, I guess they started school about 9 a.m. And then about 1:30, Clara called us and said, "Oh, it's time to come pick me up. School is over." So usually expecting the 8 to 3 or so, span of time, we suddenly discovered that we had to pack our workday at the University of Oslo into a much smaller amount of time. So one thing we discovered was there is this much smaller amount of instructional time. But a second thing that we noticed is that there's, in fact, much less emphasis on academics. And the curriculum in Norway includes time for things like puppet making, handwork, basket weaving, woodworking, as well as 60 minutes is required every day for students to be outside. And don't forget, that's in the time between 9 o'clock and 1:30. So we're really collapsing that amount of time. And that was, for Clara, that actually translated into her 4th grade teacher, literally in the month of January, once a week for 4 weeks, she took them the entire day cross-country skiing in the woods. So Clara would get on the subway with her skis, get off the subway, not even go into the school, ski off into the woods, ski back, get back on the subway, and go home. So less emphasis on academics. There was also less homework, which kind of went along with that. And about the only amount of homework that the kids had to do were the math worksheets that we tried to force them to do to, quote unquote, keep up with what we thought was happening at home. And I have to say, that was probably the most unpleasant part of the entire Norwegian experience, as those of you who've worked on homework at home with your own kids may have experienced. But finally, it's really interesting that there has been traditionally a very limited focus on testing and assessment, which includes, up until the last 10 years or so, there had been no national testing of any kind. And there's still a regulation in Norway that forbids teachers up until 8th grade from giving their students written marks. So you are required to have a conversation with parents and students about their performance, but you cannot give them an A, a B, or an F. You cannot give them a 100 or a 50 or a 1. That's a very explicit kind of prohibition. So as my wife and I, Karen Hammernes, who's also an educator and part of the reason we got to Norway, Hammernes, she's her father is Norwegian heritage. But as we were going through the year in Norway, we started to try to add this up. So wait a second, you're telling me that in Norway, there's less instructional time than the US, there's less emphasis on academics, there's less homework, there's limited testing and assessment, and you still perform about the same as the US? It's like you're doing as well as the US without even trying. And that's what we told our colleagues, who were our Norwegian colleagues, many of whom were legitimately concerned about the performance of the schools. We're like, I mean, how well could you do when you don't even do any of these things? But part of what was interesting about the time in Norway, and those of you who've had opportunities to spend time in other cultures have certainly experienced this, over time, you begin to get some glimpses of why things are the way they are. And two stories, again, really kind of lit that light bulb that helped us understand what was happening with the Norwegian education system. And they were two conversations with two parents who didn't even know each other, but were very similar. One had a daughter who I think was a second grader or third grader, and they were talking about their experience when their daughter, they thought, was really excelling, and she'd already learned how to read, and she needed to be pushed further. They were concerned she wasn't being challenged in school. But an alternate parent that we talked to had kind of the opposite problem. I think they had a daughter in third grade, and they were concerned that she wasn't learning to read, and so needed some extra help. These two people who didn't even know each other told us these stories independently, said they went to the child's teacher, told them the problem, and each teacher came back with the same response, which was, don't worry about it, they'll take care of it in high school. And that's the way the system is designed. It's designed to take care of it in high school. That's where the focus is on academics. And Norway has made an explicit commitment to make primary school in particular, up until around 8th grade, especially, as a foundation and a focus on equity, on the development of the whole child, on a development of a sense of nationhood and of being a Norwegian. And so from that perspective, the Norwegian system is not designed to do well on PISA. So part of the point and the lesson that I took away from this is not that, oh, we need to do what Norway's doing. It's to understand and recognize the strengths and weaknesses that are in every system, and to understand in particular the geographic, political, economic, and sociocultural conditions that have helped to create these systems, but they also help to create the efforts to change those systems. And the reality is there's a whole set of reasons why the Norwegians have created a system that has more academic focus in high school than in primary school. And in order to do better on PISA, it's not just a matter of improving instruction. It's a matter of fundamentally coming to terms with the basic values and conditions that have put that system in place in the first place. And we could talk more about what those conditions are, but I want to make sure we have enough time for conversation. So I'm going to glide over them a little bit and get back to the main point that I took away from it, which is, from that perspective, education reform is so far beyond any kind of technical enterprise, or, you know, it's not something that's just waiting for a new curriculum to be created or a new technology to be implemented. It requires a fundamental reevaluation of the values and conditions that have put in place our education systems, both their strengths and their weaknesses. And it's not so much the system that has to change as it is our understanding, our beliefs that we have to change as well. So if we're really trying to change systems by relying on the same values and beliefs with many of the same conditions that established the conventional school system in the first place, what's actually going to change? And so in the US, one perfect example of that is we have a system where some individuals can succeed. It's based on sorting. It's highly inequitable. It has institutionalized and systemic racism at its roots. And yet, some of our primary ways we see of improving that system is by appealing to accountability, rewards for performance, focusing on individuals in ways that often exacerbate or reinforce those inequities and that individual focus. And that's why, from my perspective, I argue that we really need these kinds of networks and opportunities to build relationships across educators, but also inside and outside schools and with amongst different sectors that will really allow us to develop the common understanding, the capacity, and the collective responsibility to fuel the social movements that ultimately are going to transform education and society together in the future. And from that perspective, the whole notion that education and changing education somehow drives the economy and change society, that in and of itself has to be questioned. Society and education, the changes there have to go together hand in hand. I can stop there. There's a lot more that could be said, but that's one of the pivotal experiences in Norway that helped to contribute to some of the key ideas in the book. So I'm going to stop the screen share and see if, Heidi, if you have some questions, or there, I can now put my glasses on and start to read the chat, I realize.
I was going to say, so I think, and Tiawanda just dropped a question in, which Tiawanda, you might want to ask. And Tom and I have already talked a little bit. There's some kind of specific instances from his book and kind of pieces of things that he talks about. But I think, Tom, this would probably be a great place. I was just thinking teachers are great students because everybody was like taking notes. But Tiawanda, do you want to go ahead and just ask your question?
Yeah, sure. My question is, I've done a little bit of research regarding the PISA, and just wondering, you know, in terms of your work in Norway, do you see some ways that we can improve in terms of moving up the scale collectively as in the US for the PISA? Because, you know, there's this prediction out there that those who are scoring higher on the PISA have a better chance for economic viability. I'm just wondering what you saw, what the connections are with that, as well as, you know, just some of the backdrop that the scores are somewhat manipulated, because Singapore kind of puts their best kids out there to test. It's kind of rumored that that's kind of what they do. And, you know, and what are your thoughts around, I guess this is a lot of questions, around some of our high performing schools here in the US, and how kids are kind of all grouped and, you know, and clustered versus a diversified learning environment where you can pull some of the other kids up who are low performing.
Yeah, there are a number of really important questions there, but in a way you did a nice sequence, because your second question in a way addressed your first question, which is, you know, there are ways to move up the PISA ladder and the rankings. The question is whether we should, or whether anyone wants to. And one of the reasons that's a question is because that whole idea that somehow scoring higher in PISA produces a higher performing economy is suspect. There are certainly people who believe that, but there are plenty of people who don't believe that. And I think Singapore is a good case in point. I think you might be referring to Shanghai, in terms of Shanghai is the one where they're definitely not, we're not testing all kids in China. I mean, all kids in China are not in school. China has a huge problem with an out of school population, but they do have large numbers of kids in Shanghai who perform very well on PISA. The thing about the Singaporean system that many people don't understand is Singapore actually chose not to participate in PISA until, I can't remember, the second or third iteration, until they felt they could do well on it. So they actually tied their system performance to PISA. And so part of my argument is that systems like Finland and Singapore are well aligned to PISA. Now, Finland is interesting because Finland is actually dropping on the PISA charts in the PISA rankings. And a lot of people, mostly outside Finland, are concerned about that. Folks in Finland are much less concerned about the overall drop in PISA ranking than they are that performance is becoming much less equitable. So for Finland, the key is not so much high PISA performance, it's maintaining a more equitable system. system. And in part, they do it by making sure that there isn't that tracking into lower levels. In fact, they're very well known in their primary school system for a nimble set of assessments that quickly identify students who are falling behind and bringing them together. And so in fact, the Finnish system is, in a sense, based on the recognition that there is a normal curve in performance. And therefore, there should be a concentration and focus on those. You're going to have some students on the lower end, and then rather than just dropping them out and saying, oh, they weren't performing well by third grade on reading, therefore they're never going to make it, actually devoting some time and resources to those students so they get the support they need to be able to continue in the system. So my long answer to the question boils down to that note that it's more important to understand how our system works, what our strengths and weaknesses are, what are the values that we care about, and trying to align our system with that. And then thinking about, secondly, okay, so how is that going to position us in terms of PISA or these other international rankings?
Thank you.
Yeah, Sabrina's got a good question here too. Do you want to ask that, Sabrina?
Invite you to just share your thoughts about kind of this fundamental question. I saw it in your slides, that the idea that in Norway, they think about education as a tool for equity. Like how, in your opinion, in your observation, your work, how have you noticed how a society really answers that question explicitly or implicitly? What's the purpose of education? How does that influence how they go about establishing and implementing schooling?
Yeah, I think that's one of the central pieces. And so that's part of, in the book, I talk a little bit more about the Norwegian system, the Finnish system, and the Singaporean system. So in Norway, I think it's a country where you have a common set of goals and values that are reflected in the design of the entire system, not just the education system. So Norway, it's not just about what's the purpose of education. In Norway, it's kind of like, what's the purpose of the government? And the purpose of the government is to take the money that they've gained from the oil reserves that they discovered and to invest it so that they can support the social welfare state for 20 generations into the future. Under those conditions, the purpose of education can be to focus on becoming more equitable, to have time to play and all of those things, because Norway has, in a sense, created that possibility. That was not a foregone conclusion. That was a huge debate about what to do with the oil reserves, and they easily could have gone in a much more privatized direction. Finland and Singapore spend much more time, and they've developed mechanisms to bring members of the society together to talk about the purposes of education and the goals of the system at any time. So the Finnish, actually about every 10 years, they have a curriculum renewal process where there's a group of stakeholders, which is largely composed of teachers, but also researchers, business folks, politicians, and others who review the curriculum, think about where the whole country is headed, and propose changes to the national education goals and national education framework. And those changes are actually discussed at every level of the system. So you might have committees of stakeholders at the school level discussing what the folks at the national level are doing. And for me, those are the critical mechanisms for developing the relationships that where even if we disagree about the purposes of education, we can at least talk about them. We have no grounds for doing that. I mean, a Board of Education meeting here in my town of Hastings-on-Hudson is not a productive or constructive place for that kind of conversation. So the question is, where is the place for that kind of conversation in a system like the US? Does that help, or do you want to follow up?
No, I was waiting for you to tell us where is a place for that kind of conversation in a system like the US. I mean, it's like we have the states rule education, and then technically there's local voice, but really not really. That's kind of school board meetings all over the country sound like the one in your area. Also, we have the move in urban spaces where we don't have school boards anymore. Everything's mayorally controlled. Like, so I was hoping that your next utterance would be an answer to that question.
Well, so I mean, the move in that direction is really what I think we have to do right now, particularly in this country, but it's true in other places as well. Is we really have to look for those opportunities where people can work together and develop the relationships so that we can like productively disagree and get to know one another and maybe then find some areas of common interest. So my argument and my experiences actually build on the work of a lot of community organizers. Some of the most effective school reform efforts I've seen were those led by community organizers in Texas and the Southwest. And I talk about that again a little bit in the book, but the basic idea of the community organizing work is you start by going door to door, room to room, in the school, outside the school, and you ask people, what are you concerned about? What do you care about? And you try together to find those areas of common interest, which produce what I call high leverage problems that if you said, and the problem that you all are working on, which is getting, more kids into college, especially, kids who've been denied access, for systemically through over the years, that's a high leverage problem. There are very few people who look at that problem and say, oh, that's not really an issue. But the key is to try and find some of these common issues that people actually care about, and where we can actually make some progress over specific, short periods of time. Again, access to college is, I think, in this realm because we know of ways by, making FAFSA better, by providing certain kinds of funding, by limiting the barriers that are, creating inequities in terms of access to information or social capital that will enable kids to get to college. Those are very concrete things we can work on. And it's when people work on those things together that they care about and can make some progress, that really kind of builds what I think of as the infrastructure, both, kind of physically and socially for moving the system forward. But it is definitely, a bottom-up approach in that sense. That's why I'd also like to see it married with a climate change like social movement to address the issues of equity that are, holding the system back in the first place.
I'm not sure how to phrase this as a question, but I guess I'm curious to what extent you see school systems as it seems like in Norway and Finland, for example, schools are seen as one of a variety of intersecting tools that are part of a social welfare system, right? Whereas in the United States, it seems we like to say that schools are like where we should be driving equity and like meritocracy and all this. Like, do you think schools can be effective drivers of increasing equity in the absence of a stronger like social net political system? Like, I don't know if I'm making sense, but I guess like in the context of the US, like, is that even really a thing?
That is, you're absolutely putting your finger on a critical problem. And I think too often, and I've had, conversations with superintendents about this, so again, it's the choice. Okay, should I spend my time trying to lobby the government, the county to come up with the meals, the money, the health support, the job support, should I help try to engage the broader community in discussing issues of equity, or do I only focus on, those things I can control? And I know superintendents and educators and everybody works really hard and they already have too much to do, but I don't think we have any choice. We have to do both. Things will not change if we only try to do one or the other. So the challenge is to try to figure out how to do that. Part of my argument is, Singapore and Finland put together their comprehensive education systems over a period of 30 or 40 years. And I know nobody wants to wait 30 or 40 years for the system to change. But I think we do have to take that kind of time horizon and recognize that, the work we have to do around equity and creating this, the supports for health and, economic health and housing is going to take a long time, just like the work on climate change is going to take a long time. But if we don't start working on it now and do what we can to recycle our own household goods, we're never going to get to that place 30 or 40 years from now.
Tom, what you just commented on reminded me when David Deming joined us back in December, we were talking about kind of commitments, for example, to make like community college education or even four-year education free in this country. And the question was kind of the time frame. And he also was arguing for a much longer time frame than I think people are intuitively comfortable with, based on kind of like the history of what the time frame of effective educational change really looks like. Like educational changes that have stuck with us are often happening in that larger time frame that he mentioned back then, but you're also mentioning now.
Yeah, and I think that's I think part of the problem we're facing is there's lots of people who feel like we can transform this system. I mean, it's sort of like name that tune, right? I can do that in 2 years. If we had the right technology, we could do it in 1 year. If we come out of the pandemic, right, we'll have this fixed by next year. And I think it actually creates a set of expectations which are impossible to meet. And it sort of feeds into this notion of kind of the individual or the silver bullet solution or the charismatic leader who can get everything done in their 3 or 4 year tenure, or whatever that is. If we actually took the attitude that, I am part of a change that's going to take place over 30, 40 years, we've got to be a lot more humble and a lot more focused in the work that we do.
Trying to allow time. This is like the reading the Zoom room to figure out if there's actually questions about to emerge or not. I think, Tom, one of the things that you talk about in the book that might be really interesting to hear about is your discussions about both high leverage problems, like where we should be focusing our efforts, but also the power of micro innovations. And I think particularly for this group, where we both care about the large picture, but folks also have control over their local spheres. I think maybe hearing some about the high leverage problems and the micro innovations might be a particularly powerful piece, if you can think of an example or two to pull out and share.
Yeah. So for me, it's really about trying to build on this work of community organizing and finding ways to bring collaborative groups together to address problems where we can make progress in short periods of time. And then if we can strategically kind of orchestrate our work on those over a number of years, we can actually build the resources and the supports that are going to enable us to have a much stronger education system moving forward. So from my perspective, in primary school, chronic absences, is, it could be a high leverage problem at any level, but it's certainly critical in primary school. But I think there's a series of kind of high leverage problems in elementary school we could address that would help and could help to dramatically improve our ability to support students to learn to read. And so I talk about it in the book. It's a simple set of, you think, first of all, we've got kids in schools all over that have never had a vision exam. So they may not have glasses if they need them. But, we know how to give kids glasses, right? We know how to match kids with glasses. We could solve that problem. So there's a group of kids who could directly benefit right now for access to a resource that's inequitably distributed. Secondly, so we put, glasses in kids' hands. We put vision screenings in place. Secondly, there's plenty of evidence that there are kids who were denied access to diverse, to books at all, but certainly to access to materials from diverse authors and diverse perspectives. We also know that there are some very somewhat simple ways, like, literally there are book vending machines that can be placed in communities and doctors' offices and other places that have been shown to to increase access to books. Dolly Parton supports one of those programs. We could also put, so I'd like to see a community doing vision and getting books in place, but then also working on the issue of chronic absence, because if kids are going to learn to read, they need to be in school. So you get kids in school with glasses, with books, and now you make sure you're identifying those kids like the Finns do who need help and support in kindergarten, first grade, haven't gotten it before. Make sure they get it so they can keep up and stay a part of it. That's not going to solve everything. It's not going to work for everybody, but it's an area where we already have the capacity to make significant improvements in lots of different communities. I think the same can be said for that kind of orchestrated response around access to college and why this group is so interesting. I think just within the group that's here, it would be fascinating to hear about what are the problems that we already know how to solve that are contributing to the inequities and the difficulties that some students are having in getting to college. And let's lay out and think about an orchestrated and strategic way of doing that. And I know many of you may be working on your own in your own communities, but that's a kind of network-like strategy that you could be a part of, even if it's not something that at this moment you have the capacity to carry out in your country, in your particular circumstance.
Kate, I feel like he took your question and just tossed it back at us, but would you and your Zoom partner there like to ask the question?
Did you say me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm just, first of all, this is just an observation as I'm listening to President Biden roll out his idea that 2 years of community college should be free. I come back to our discussion about, about undermatching at different levels. And are we going to be putting in place a system, because it's free, that is going to have many of our kids undermatched, right? They're going to go to community college when they really need to be in a much more rich, and not that community college is bad, I'm not saying that at all, but that, that access to research and to the labs and all the things that they would have if that wasn't the only option. But that's just something I was thinking of. But my question is just that we know that there are some systemic bottlenecks that between high school and college. What are some of the ones that we don't recognize as easily that maybe you're aware of? And are there schools that are getting it right that we can look to, as kind of a model to get started?
Can you say what are some of the systemic bottlenecks that we have identified?
Yeah, and maybe not the ones that are so obvious, but the ones that we may not recognize,
But what do you see as the ones that we already do recognize?
I think definitely, just lack of knowledge of for our undermatched kids. The kids that have opportunity and have people at home that are pushing them and getting them to college visits and doing all those kinds of things. Sorry, I've got a cat that's been neglected today, and now I'm going to sneeze. But I think. I think that a lot of schools don't even have systems in place to really help kids through that process. It's kind of if you know someone, you get the help, and if you don't, you don't.
Yeah, I'm sure there are hidden bottlenecks, but I think part of the point of high leverage problems is there are some obvious bottlenecks. There's some obvious stuff that we actually could do that we haven't done it. And just to shift off the college point at a moment, I mean, one is internet access. I mean, we have incredibly inequitable internet access, and all of a sudden we had the pandemic and companies are falling all over themselves to give people free access and everything. It's like, just do it, for God's sake. I mean, there are some problems we could actually solve if we were willing to solve it. And, so that's part of the issue. So my argument would be, I mean, we are in the process of unpacking all of those barriers that are put in place that are supposed to be the ways to help and streamline the process or build the pipeline to college. But every time you build a pipeline to college, I mean, it has walls. You have some people who are in it and some people who are outside of it. So we actually need to think about how to kind of take the pipeline apart so that it's much easier for kids to get access. So, the University of Michigan, and I think Heidi and Jerome, we talked about this, they had an experiment where they essentially instead of community college, they send kids a letter that says, you can come to the University of Michigan, right? Because you had, meet certain criteria. You don't have to apply. You don't have to do anything else. Just show up. We'll give you the money. And, again, we got to track and make sure these things actually work and there aren't, incidental problems with them that create other issues, and that they actually are addressing issues of equity. But to me, that's a really good place to start. So, yeah, I mean, I do have concerns about the idea of just getting kids into community college. There's also a way to get kids out of community college and onto the next level or to a job or whatever, that's different. So I think we really need to be thinking strategically about how to move in these different directions.
We're working on our team is working on an op-ed. And so I was really hoping you were going to give me some really good buzzwords and things that I could like. So I've got this metaphor of the pipeline, and I'm thinking, all right, what can we do with that? So thank you.
All right, well, yeah, I do think that the pipeline is a double-edged sword, right? So every time we are building access in some ways that has certain criteria, we're also creating barriers. So
Allison, do you want to ask, because we have a couple of folks on here, Tom, who are in the charter school system. And Allison asks about charter schools.
So my take on charter schools has really been the same from the beginning. And I know charter schools cannot be divorced from the politics, and I don't think we should divorce them from the politics, but we also have to understand that charter schools are not just the politics. And so from my perspective, charter schools are just another kind of school, as are private schools, as are religious schools, as are Montessori schools, as are magnet schools. And all of my work has really been about the choice of what kind of school to have does not in and of itself determine whether or not that school is going to be successful or transformational or get kids into college or help kids to develop a deeper understanding. It's just like different countries in a sense. These kinds of schools operate in somewhat different conditions. And we need to understand what those conditions are in order for those kinds of schools to excel. It's a position which says the idea that somehow by creating successful charter schools, they will somehow, replicate and multiply and then, replace, other, public schools. It hasn't happened in 30 years already. I don't really see that it's going to happen in the future, but we certainly could have a system where you have successful charter schools, you have successful schools that are under the superintendent's purview, where you have private schools that are successful. But that is not to say that right now, charter schools and public schools and private schools are in a somewhat competitive environment that can make it harder for all of them, or certainly some of them, to be effective. So from my perspective, either charter schools or any one of these kind of network solutions or privatized solutions is not really going to address the problems down the line. And my biggest concern is the way they divide people ultimately because of the political issues. But that does not mean I think they should be eliminated or they're somehow bad for the system. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what charter folks who are working in charters think about that.
We don't have time for that.
Well, I just want to know how mad I've made you, that's all.
No, not at all. I mean, I have an existential crisis every morning. I get ready to go to work at a charter school. So I thought that was a great answer. It was very nuanced. I super appreciated it. So for me, the issue is, how can we take advantage of the strengths that any school has so that it's not just building support for the students we have right now, but it's helping to contribute to the development of the resources, the relationships, the facilities, the knowledge and expertise that's going to allow us to be more effective in the future. And that's expertise and resources that can develop in any context. The problem is that we're never able to kind of collect that, articulate that, bring it out in ways that supports schools moving forward. That's my argument about what's worked in Singapore and Finland. They have built a really strong instructional infrastructure of people, services, resources, facilities that really supports those systems moving forward. But I will say they have a strong existing instructional infrastructure. Neither one of them is having that much success in transforming that instructional infrastructure so that it's not so academically focused, so that it supports socio-emotional learning, so it supports 21st century skills or anything like that. But I do believe over a period of 30 or 40 years, they could achieve that.
Randy, do you want to go ahead and ask your question about that time, schools thinking of that time frame?
Well, I was just wondering, it can, first of all, what you're talking about be enacted or lived on what I might think of as the meso level, like lower than the macro national level? And if so, are there any examples of private or public systems at the meso level that are trying to think 20 to 40 years out?
Yeah, it's a great and challenging question, and I think I can't. Maybe it was Sabrina who was talking about the different levels of the system, and that's the level that's missing. Is it's who is it that's going to take responsibility for a community for a 30 or 40 year period? It's not the mayor. He's not going to be there. It's not the superintendent. I think, funders have tried to play that role. So if you look at collective impact efforts in places like Cincinnati and the STRIDE initiative, the Promised Neighborhoods initiative out of the Obama administration, I think these are efforts to try to develop a collaborative that serves as that kind of regional authority. And part of my look across at these different systems is to argue that that's exactly what we need. We need regional authorities collaborations that respond to whatever the geographic circumstances might be. So, we need, it's going to have to reflect geographies, and, so maybe Vermont can be one, or Maine can be one on its own, but the San Francisco Bay Area has got to be, broken up into little ones. Boston has a metropolitan area, could be a great region, but then who's in charge of that region? Again, it's not, the Boston mayor can't do it. In New York, we see it's not Cuomo and it's not de Blasio. So, who is it that's going to play that role? I think we have to invent. This is where, connecting with our political science and other our other folks is really so important. We need new inventions at that level in terms of governance and regional support. But it's the same thing we need for climate change, I would argue. So that's again where I think we need a convergence in terms of the work we're doing for things like education and social movements around issues like climate change, where again, the issues are so regional in terms of pollution, heat, weather, all of those things. But I would also, so the Norwegians and the Finns and the Danes, the Dutch, they're all designed, they have political systems that are designed for collaboration, right? Even unions, are expected to come to agreement and be part of the collaboration process. In the US, that's not a fundamental value, which is why I've emphasized so much. And there's stories, other pivotal moments where I really understood, how in Norway and Finland, there's a focus on collective responsibility, which is really totally different from the focus on individual accountability, or what I call answerability, in the US. And so that's something we have to face and confront head on. I took my glasses off, Heidi, so now I can't.
Sorry. Randy and I are both kind of chipping in comments here. Randy's thinking about funders like Gates, who funded 25 years of 1 to 5 year solutions. And my question was whether actually schools outside of the public domain were possibly in a better position to claim these longer timeframes, because they're not as subject to the whims of election cycles.
It's possible, but they're sort of subject to the cult of personality, because then it's the headmaster who's been there for 20 or 30 years or something, and that's not necessarily a solution. In Norway, the student union has a really important role to play and a voice. So there's a notion of a multi-generational collaboration from the beginning. And so I think that's part of what we need to be imagining in the first place, right? Is if it's a 30 or 40 year time frame, we don't wait until students are 30 or 40 to engage them in the process, right? We want to, that process should be a part of education from the very beginning, being engaged in society and thinking about where we want to be 30 or 40 years from now. But it doesn't hurt to have a government that's doing that. Singapore, when the first stuff around climate change came around, the government, they didn't sit there saying, they looked at the evidence. Yeah, there's some people that are saying maybe we're not going to have the sea levels rising, but they looked around, they said, well, some people are saying the sea levels rise, and if the sea levels rise, we're going to be underwater in 30 or 40 years, and therefore they brought in the Dutch for expertise around dikes and how you maintain a society when it's underwater, and they've been working on it ever since.
It'd be interesting in hearing your thoughts on the tension, right, that's there with a 30 to 40 year time frame, the collective commission, or the level of commitment we need to have as a collective to that time frame, with the pressing issues of equity, right? Like what happens to the youth in those 30s. So it's not just the cult of personality or the political cycles. It's also the fact that there are children in schools right now who are not thriving, and
Right.
how we manage that tension. If you've seen other countries or even localities, we're thinking about the community organizing you mentioned from the ground up. There are other small spaces where they're actually managing that tension productively.
Yeah, I mean, you know, these are just really difficult issues. And, you know, so these choices about whether to invest in something that's going to come to fruition, hopefully in 30 to 40 years, or maybe spend more time so that, you know, somebody gets help and support right now. I mean, these are life and death decisions like those that have been made in the pandemic over the last year. And, you know, so I don't know the answer to that. That's part of why I think we have to do both. To me, it's a little bit like, you know, the work on the school to prison pipeline, and the idea that, you know, at this, you know, we have to be doing the work right now in terms of bail reform, in terms of, you know, the nitty gritty regulations, in terms of the way policing is done, that are going to make some real changes right now. But, you know, at the same time, we also have to be building fewer prisons and doing, you know, thinking long term about how we might have a society that operates differently in the future. And so for me, that's why I go back again to the community organizing, engaging communities around problems that are real right now and doing real work around those at the same time that we're building those relationships and that understanding that hopefully can drive us through. But we can't be doing the work of, you know, supporting 30 or 40 years from now at the expense of, you know, the students and the schools we have right now.
Tom, I think one of the things that's struck me in reading your book, once when it came out and once this past weekend in preparation for today, was how much of what you're talking about is about kind of the location grounded, whether it's at a country level where the country's organized, or in your high leverage problems and micro innovations where it's at kind of a particular location. One of the things that we think about a lot in the Pivotal Network is that people are coming, our teachers are coming from such diverse systems, from urban, from rural, from public, from charter, from private, from all over the country. And so everyone has their own locality and the specifics of that locality. I think one of the things folks talk about a lot, though, is how important it is also to get outside of that locality to gain that perspective. So I guess I'm just curious about, and I think sometimes we feel this tension between the need to act locally within the norms, the mores of every individual teacher's systems, but also what we gain from learning from the outside world. And I guess I'm curious about that, because so many examples in your book were about kind of knowing your place so well. I'm keen about your sense about what the value is of that outside perspective to act locally.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the irony is, I think we gain an understanding. I mean, other people, you know, certainly say this. We gain an understanding of our place and our community in part by getting outside of it. And so for me, being in Norway and learning these other systems has allowed me, you know, it's given me some opportunities to think differently about the failures that I've experienced in terms of school reform and how we might approach them differently. And you know, with all this work, I think we have to be realistic about how much it actually takes and how much time is involved, and that there are competing forces. So that, you know, we cannot create more time so that we can both, you know, dig in and go deeply into our local community and go outside and have all the time we need to be connecting with other people and learning about what's happening elsewhere. But it's also, I think, the case that each of us doesn't have to do everything always. Some of us may be more focused locally. Others may, reach out and be looking more across contexts. But if we're actually connected locally, then we can take advantage of those different perspectives and that different work. Part of the issue is we just have to, clear out the brush, clear away a lot of the stuff that, we don't really need to do, and figure out ways to focus on, what's really important. And again, I go back to climate change, because, there's a lot of things to focus on besides climate change, including education and other things. But if we don't figure out how to spend enough time working on climate change along with those things, then a lot of other things aren't going to, potentially may not matter. So I think we have to recognize much more centrally how limited and how important time is. And part of my argument, again, in schools, if we really want to open schools up to supporting all kinds of different abilities, my argument is actually, right now with a lot of the ideas is, okay, we double down on academics. We expand the school day and have kids, relearn stuff or reteach it in different ways. And I think what we actually need to do is make more time and space for kids to learn in different ways, for them to get outside, for them to develop their interpersonal and socio-emotional abilities. But we can't do that until we cut down the demands in terms of academics, ideally enabling kids to learn the critical foundational skills they need in a much more efficient, effective, and equitable way, and in shorter periods of time. So that's actually my argument against, so let's not double down on learning loss. Let's not expand the school day. Let's not try to do 2 years in 1 year. Actually, let's go the other direction. Let's cut the curriculum in half. Let's condense the school day and recognize that kids are going to come in with needs for social engagement with their friends, for socio-emotional support, that they have also, and physical activities and access to sports that they have lost or had difficulty accessing this past year as well.
Tom, I know at the beginning of the conversation we talked about your book title and the pushback on it, if it was relevant or not. But I think I speak for all of us on the screen by just highlighting how much everything you shared tonight and which you've kind of spent so much time and so much of your career focusing on is incredibly relevant to us as individuals, as educators on the screen in both higher education and K through 12, but also to us as a network in the Pivotal Network and this mission. I think we definitely see ourselves as outliers and trying to kind of do, as you said, how do we both work with what we have right now in real time, but also be looking forward in very innovative and imaginative ways as to what we can do as a collective. So I just want to be mindful of time, but I also just want to say thank you immensely for spending your evening with us and imparting so much wisdom. And we have this recorded. So I know for those of you who couldn't take notes fast enough, it'll be on our YouTube page soon enough. But I can't say thank you enough. Tonight has been so enlightening, even for myself.
Well, I mean, I really appreciate that, Jerome, but I have to say, I mean, it's your questions. You get so quickly to these critical issues and the complexities here. I mean, there are no easy answers, but you demonstrated in an hour the depth of your, all of your thinking and concern around these issues. And I'll double down on what I said before, which is I do believe it's these kinds of networks where people come together, especially across different geographies, with a common concern that are really instrumental to helping see those changes we want to see in 30 or 40 years. And I do think, as Heidi mentioned, I mean, I do talk about micro innovations. One way to think about what are the specific things you're creating, the materials, the solutions, the workarounds in your own work or in your neighborhood that we can hold up and we can share with other people. So there's tangible things for people to take away from your work. So I look forward to hearing and seeing more about that too.
Well, you will, because that's why we snagged you on our advisory board, Tom. So we will be talking again very soon. But thank you so much. And thank you all for spending your evening with us. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
Folks, thank you so much, Tom. This was brilliant. And we're going to talk more with you in a couple of weeks. So thank you so much.
A few minutes here if anybody has anything else.
Okay. Thanks, friends. Thank you for joining. Kate, do you have a question here? Oh, okay.
No, I'm just sitting here thinking.
Thanks all. Take care.
How do I ask now? We definitely need to focus post-pandemic, but what is our, I'm keeping it at 10 years. I don't know that I can go 20 years out. 20 more years in ninth grade essays, I just can't do it.